Waking up in a stone icebox. Your day begins before dawn in a frigid stone cell with zero insulation and a prayer to stay warm. Layering up with faith and wool, you dress in itchy layers of woolen habits, linen shifts, and maybe sneak in a second wimple, just don't tell Mother Superior. Heating up with holy chores. You scrub, sweep, and stoke the chapel fire, partly for piety, mostly so your fingers don't fall off. Communal warmth and the blanket rule. You huddle with your sisters during psalms and meals, just close enough for warmth, but not too close vow-wise. Fireplaces with more rules than flames. You gather around the single hearth, watched by a stern prioress who regulates logs like they're gold coins. Inventive layering and smuggled cloaks. Some sisters get creative with extra cowls, sheep wool padding, and it's not a blanket, it's a robe loophole. Warming by work kitchen duty. You rotate into the kitchen for bread baking or broth stirring, aka the monastery's hottest real estate. Herbal remedies and warm wine cheats. You learn the art of ginger tea, spiced mead, and warming tonics that are technically medicinal. Hey guys, tonight, we journey back in time, not to knights or kings, but to the quiet stone corridors of a medieval convent. You're about to spend a day as a nun in the dead of winter, somewhere between the 12th and 14th centuries, when staying warm was a full-time job, and most modern comforts were considered either sinful or suspicious. You wake up in darkness, not just early morning darkness, but the kind that seeps into your bones. Your cell, more like a glorified closet, really is made of cold, unyielding stone. There's one tiny slit of a window offering neither light nor mercy. The bed is a wooden frame topped with a straw mattress that crunches under you like autumn leaves. Your blanket, one thin woolen layer, scratchy as penance and colder than a gossiping novice's stare. And you, noble time traveler, have survived the night. Sort of. You've been awake off and on since midnight prayers. Every time you moved, the cold found a new part of you to torment. Your breath puffs into the air like mist, and you try to decide whether your toes are numb or just gone. Welcome to monastic life. You probably won't survive this without a mild case of frostbite and a strong sense of humor. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and the local time. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your day begins before dawn, of course it does. The bell rings in the distance, clanging from the chapel tower with the enthusiasm of a tired donkey. You groan not audibly, God forbid, and pull yourself up. Your knees creak like ancient pews. You aren't allowed much in the way of comfort, just the clothes on your back and the warmth you can wring out of a few habits. The stone floor beneath your feet is so cold, it almost feels alive, like it's breathing against your skin. You shuffle to the water basin in the corner of your cell and splash your face with icy water. No heated wash basins here, just raw medieval realism. Rumor has it that a sister once whispered blasphemy when someone dared to warm their water over a candle. That sister was reassigned to the outdoor latrine for a week. You won't be making that mistake. There's no time for dawdling. Morning prayers wait for no one, and punctuality is basically the sixth sacrament in this place. You quickly wrap your hair and slip into your full habit linen shift first, then woolen tunic, scapular belt veil, and finally the ever-important wimple. It's like assembling armor but fluffier and more obedient to scripture, sort of. Each layer traps a bit more heat, and you say a silent prayer of thanks for the nun who sewed an extra bit of lining into your tunic last year. You step into the corridor. The wind that sneaks through the hallway stones is no less vicious than what you'd find outside. Historians still argue whether medieval convents were designed more for piety or penance by hypothermia. The air smells faintly of beeswax, mildew, and cold. Yes, cold has a smell when it's old enough. You join the procession to the chapel. Sisters shuffle in near silence, all similarly wrapped bundles of fabric and stoicism. You catch the eye of Sister Agnes, who gives you a nod that clearly translates to, "If I don't move my face too much, I might retain heat." Everyone's breath clouds in the early light. The chapel itself isn't much warmer. A single brazier glows faintly near the altar. It's more ceremonial than useful, like heating a whole gymnasium with a scented candle. The stone benches are unwelcoming and ice-cold. You kneel, trying not to let your knees scream too loud. The psalms echo through the chamber in long, sleepy Latin phrases. The rhythm is hypnotic, ancient, and, yes, a little boring, which is half the point. Your mind drifts between verses not to sinful thoughts, but to warm things, soup, a fireplace, possibly the sun. Just once you'd like to pray while feeling your fingertips. Your stomach rumbles. You'll eat after lauds, and the meal will be wait for it barley porridge. Again. Lukewarm, if you're lucky. The kitchen fire is reserved for the day's bigger chores, not breakfast. You rub your hands together discreetly, catching a tiny thrill when they briefly feel almost room temperature. A historical fun fact to distract you: monasteries and convents often had designated warming rooms, but these were usually reserved for the infirm or scribes working with ink that froze in winter. You're neither, so don't even think about sneaking in there. Not unless you want to spend the next week copying the Book of Revelation with frozen fingers. And now, the final bell tolls. Morning prayers are complete, and your real day begins still before sunrise. You rise stiffly, joints, clicking fabric, crackling. You file out with the other sisters, all of you moving like cold, solemn penguins. The hallway greets you again with its frosty embrace, but there's hope in the next hour. Your assigned chore, cleaning the library floors, which means movement, which means warmth even if just a smidge. You pick up your broom worn smooth by decades of use and get to work. As you sweep you warm from the inside out, and maybe, just maybe, you manage a smile. Because here, even small victories like warm elbows feel like divine intervention. The broom is rough in your hands, but it's a small price to pay for the luxury of motion. You sweep across the cold stone floor of the convent library, bristles scraping against the ancient flagstones like the quiet whisper of penance. Dust dances up into the sunlight, slanting in through one narrow stained glass window, the colors catching briefly on floating motes before vanishing into pale air. Your fingers begin to tingle. Hallelujah, they're thawing. And for a few precious minutes you almost forget how cold your knees are beneath your habit. The repetitive rhythm of sweeping lulls you into a kind of peace. And though it might not be divine revelation, the warmth building in your limbs feels close enough. Libraries in convents were sacred spaces, not just for books, although the handful of hand-copied manuscripts in here are guarded like holy relics, but for contemplation. This one smells like parchment beeswax, and whatever Sister Margarita's herbs are doing in the corner. You eye the pile of lavender and dried rosemary she's strategically placed near the draftiest crack in the wall. Clever. Technically, that counts as heating through olfactory illusions. You're not allowed to speak, of course. The morning hours are part of the greater silence, so any witty remarks about your frozen extremities are staying in your head, thank you very much. Still, your internal monologue is alive and well, especially when you nearly trip over a rolled-up carpet that no one's bothered to move since Advent. Under the high vaulted ceiling, your breath continues to form those little white clouds, and you begin fantasizing about illicit foot-warming devices. Did you know that some Nuns legend has it used to sneak in heated stones from the kitchen? Historians still argue whether this was frowned upon or simply ignored out of survival instincts. After all, even the strictest abbess has a heart. Probably. Maybe. You pause, setting the broom aside, and rub your hands together again. The friction is weak, but it works. Barely. You flex your fingers, which are slightly pink now, and pull your sleeves farther down over your knuckles. If you're lucky, you won't need to start tucking them into your habit belt for warmth until Vespers. As you sweep around the long reading tables, you pass by a shelf of carefully hand-bound volumes. The gilded spine of one catches your eye, de natura rerum, if you're reading the Latin right. It's probably full of philosophical musings about heat and cold and divine design. You imagine a chapter titled, "Why Thou Shalt Embrace the Chill as a Sign of Holiness," probably written by a monk who never left his cloister. There's a whisper behind you. Not literal, don't panic. It's just your fabric brushing against one of the chairs. Still, it reminds you that you're not alone in here. Sister Juliana is in the corner copying out a new antiphon with careful gloved fingers. She's fashioned the gloves herself with the fingertips removed so she can still hold her quill. Genius. You nod in subtle admiration, which she does not return. Of course not. Greater silence. The cold's creeping back in now. You've stopped moving, and it notices. You curse mentally the thermal inefficiency of wool. That might be considered a spiritual failing, but surely even saints were allowed internal grumbling. Your habit layers shift slightly as you stretch your arms above your head, shoulders popping gently like old floorboards. Time drips slowly in here. Minutes feel like hours, and your body becomes increasingly convinced that it's actually colder inside than out. There's a draft slinking under the library door. You eye it suspiciously like it's a sentient snake. Then comes a noise that snaps you from your frozen reverie, the bell. Again. Time for your mid-morning assignment to the kitchen garden, which is not currently producing anything edible, what with it being the dead of winter. But the nuns believe in order, so even empty soil needs raking. Outside, in winter, as you trudge down the corridor again, you pass through the cloister open on one side, because of course, medieval architecture didn't consider wind chill when designing serenity spaces. Snow dusts the flagstones, and your sandals crunch quietly. You've layered socks under them, yes, but that just means the snow melts more slowly into your toes. You reach the garden, where Sister Blanche is already poking at the icy ground with a rake. She greets you with a nod and a half-smile. You join her hands gripping your own rake, and you both begin clearing dead leaves and chipping at frost-covered soil. The task is largely symbolic, but symbolic effort still burns calories, and calories mean heat. Every breath clouds the air like incense. You whisper a short prayer under your breath, something about not dying of exposure, and scrape the rake along the soil. Underneath the top frost layer, the earth is slightly softer. Not warm, not even close, but softer. You take it as a sign. A strange but true tidbit: some nuns were known to line their habits with moss or straw during colder months, not for hygiene, obviously, but for insulation. Imagine that, stuffing forest fluff into your sleeves like an early down jacket. You consider it now with entirely new respect. Historians still debate just how strictly enforced the clothing rules were, especially in winter. Were extra layers under habits quietly permitted, or did some communities enforce suffering as a test of devotion? It likely varied. Some convents were more relaxed, others practically operated like Arctic military camps. You rake in silence, then pause as a particularly frigid gust slaps you in the face. It cuts straight through the layers like gossip through the refectory. You clench your jaw. You breathe out slowly. And then you keep going. Because really, what's the alternative? Go back and admit defeat to the abbess. She once famously chastised a novice for saying her hands were too cold to pray. No sympathy in this holy house. Eventually your arms ache with effort, but there's a surprising sense of satisfaction. You've generated your own heat through sheer stubbornness and muscle, and in this world that's practically divine magic. You and Sister Blanche exchange a glance, then head back toward the cloister without a word. The snow has thickened slightly, each flake bright against your dark habit. Back inside, the wind chases you briefly through the doorway before the heavy wooden door slams shut behind it. The convent swallows you again, stone walls, pale light, and the quiet hum of 100 small lives wrapped in wool and willpower. Back in the dormitory, the silence buzzes around you like static. It's not actual silence, of course. There's the subtle rustle of fabric, the creak of ancient beds, and the occasional cough echoing off the high ceiling. But it's the kind of quiet that wraps itself around your ears like thick felt. You tread softly your sandals, whispering over the worn stone, and head to your pallet. It's one of a dozen arranged in tidy rows, separated by the thinnest of wool curtains. Privacy is a modern indulgence. Here you learn to sleep with snores and sighs as your lullaby. You sit down heavily, your knees still aching from the morning's garden work. Your breath puffs in the cold air, the frost biting even here in what's supposed to be the warmest building on the grounds. You tug the edge of your habit tighter across your chest and curl forward slightly, your hands wedged between your thighs for warmth. The air has that distinct damp stone chill that never quite goes away, even in summer, but in winter, it's like the walls themselves are trying to sap your soul through your elbows. This is the time allotted for silent reading or reflection, which frankly is a joke, when your fingertips feel like ice pops and your nose is dangerously close to frostbitten. You glance toward the far end of the dormitory where Sister Agnetha is attempting to read by the narrow shaft of light bleeding through a tiny window. She's wearing what you swear is an extra veil wrapped around her shoulders, rule-bending innovation, or just holy layering. Technically, your only blanket is the one assigned to your bed. It's wool, of course, thick, scratchy, and eternally damp no matter how often it's aired out. You think wistfully of feather beds and furs, luxuries for kings and bishops. Not for you. You lie back against the wooden frame, tucking your legs up to your chest in the universal position of, I am not warm, but I'm trying. A small, impious part of you wonders whether you could fold yourself entirely into your own habit, like a self-contained wool burrito. Still, this moment of rest is a rare one, and your body gradually unclenches as you settle in. You remember something you overheard in the kitchen, that some nuns used to sleep two to a bed in the dead of winter. Not for scandal, obviously, don't be cheeky, but for warmth. Body heat is nature's best radiator, and shared suffering is half suffering, right? Historians still argue whether this was officially condoned or simply turned a blind eye to in particularly frosty abbeys. You peer across the dormitory. Sister Lucia is curled up on her side, her rosary dangling from her fingers. Her habit hood is pulled tight, practically down to her nose. A small trickle of envy seeps into your ribs. You've tried the hood thing. Your hair sticks up in all directions after, and the static shock when you pull it down is enough to trigger a minor existential crisis. Your thoughts drift to the fire. Not here, there are no hearths in the dormitory, but in the kitchen. The massive iron stove is one of the only true sources of heat in the convent, and it's strictly reserved for cooking, not congregating. But you've seen sisters hover near it just a little longer than necessary when delivering trays or picking up pots. The unspoken warmth tax. Somewhere in a distant part of the convent, a bell tolls again. You're not sure which hour it is when every day is a repeating loop of prayer labor, and cold fingers' time becomes more abstract than holy. But you know what's coming: the laundry. You groan internally. If hell has a climate, it's not fiery, it's wet stone cold, and smells faintly of sheep. You shuffle out of your blanket cocoon and make your way to the cloister again, wrapping your arms tightly around yourself as a shield. Outside, the light is waning and clouds hover low, like someone forgot to put the sky back up properly. The laundry area is a small outbuilding, stone-walled and blessed with exactly zero insulation. Water drawn from the well waits in heavy wooden buckets, already skimmed with a thin sheet of ice. You break it with a stick. Or was it a holy rod once used to chase away mice, hard to say any more? Your hands plunge into the icy water, and your entire nervous system sends a message to your soul. What did we do to deserve this? You scrub cloth against a washboard, the soap slathering up into thick, unsatisfying bubbles. It's lye-based, sharp-smelling, and rough on skin. In moments like this, you understand why nuns had such weathered hands, the kind you imagine could slice bread just by holding it. Here's a curious fact. In especially cold regions, nuns sometimes washed fewer clothes in winter, not just for practicality, but because icy water could lead to frostbite and illness. They'd rotate underlayers and use ash or sand for dry scrubbing instead. Historians still argue whether this was officially documented or just passed down as convent lore. You switch hands, flexing your numbing fingers and blowing on them ineffectively. Across from you, Sister Matilda wrings out a towel with ferocious determination. Water runs down her sleeves. You feel a sudden irrational urge to laugh. Not because anything is funny, but because everything is absurd. You're a grown woman elbow deep in freezing water, laundering socks that will be stiff with frost before they're halfway dry. As the task drags on, your joints begin to ache. You try to focus on the rhythm again, scrub, rinse, wring, repeat. Your breath forms a syncopated tempo. At one point, the handle of the washboard slips and bonks your knuckle. You hiss through your teeth. Silent suffering, you mutter softly, immediately regretting the sound. But no one reprimands you. Sister Matilda just glances up and offers a sympathetic nod. Maybe even she has her limits. By the time you finish, your sleeves are soaked and your legs feel like someone replaced the bones with icicles. You hang the wet cloths on a rope stretched between two pegs, where they will remain stiff and cold until someone finds the courage to fetch them. You trudge back inside. Your hands are raw, your feet numb. But you've made it through another hour, another ritual, another test of faith or endurance or sheer medieval stubbornness. At the dormitory door, you pause. The stone arch above the entrance is etched with a faded Latin inscription, Domus Dei et Porta Coeli, House of God and Gate of Heaven. You snort softly. It's also the house of hypothermia, but you suppose that wouldn't fit on a lintel. You step inside, dripping slightly, and breathe out a sigh. The air is just as cold as before. Maybe colder. But it's your cold now, familiar and weirdly comforting. Like a scratchy wool blanket you've had since childhood, it doesn't help much, but it's yours. You wake up with your knees tucked to your chest, and your fingers folded tight beneath your habit, your breath still curling visibly in the air, like you're living in a chimney. Morning has crept in again, slow, gray, and bitter. There's no dramatic sunrise to greet the new day, just a weak smear of light through the slit of a window, the kind of sky that looks like it gave up halfway through being blue, and you're back. It feels like you slept on a pile of unblessed bricks. Not that the straw mattress beneath you provided much to begin with. If you're lucky, there's still a few tufts of hay inside, but let's face it, this thing's seen more winters than most of the sisters here. Your joints creak as you sit up. Someone somewhere in the dormitory lets out a sigh so deep it might qualify as a confession. You swing your legs over the edge and touch the cold stone floor with bare toes. It's a waking ritual you never quite get used to, like plunging into a frozen pond, only more insulting. Now comes the real test, getting dressed, without shedding any spiritual dignity. You layer what you can, a thick linen undershift, your coarse habit, your veil tight around the ears, for wind defense, and if you're daring, maybe a second pair of woolen hose. One of the younger nuns tried to stuff straw into her shoes last week, and while innovative, it made a god-awful noise during lauds. No one's repeated the experiment. You shuffle toward the refectory, your breath puffing like a sleepy dragon. Breakfast is a solemn affair. No chatting, no laughter, just the sound of spoons on wooden bowls and the distant murmur of scripture read aloud from the pulpit. You sit at your place, fingers tight around a ceramic bowl of pottage. It's warm. Not delicious, not even particularly distinguishable in flavor, but it's warm, and that makes it a feast by medieval standards. You savor it slowly, feeling the heat climb from your tongue to your cheeks. Across the table, Sister Claire closes her eyes with each bite as if she's dreaming the broth into something more palatable. Roast goose-fresh bread. Anything that doesn't taste like boiled disappointment. You remember hearing that in some convents, nuns were allowed a little butter or cheese during especially hard winters, though this varied wildly, depending on the order and the strictness of their rule. Historians still argue whether these allowances were part of formal guidelines or just creative interpretations by particularly hungry abbesses. There's something meditative about the shared silence, a quiet rebellion against hunger, cold, and the absurdity of being awake before the sun. You chew slowly, your teeth sore from the cold, but your belly beginning to unknot itself, just a little. After breakfast, it's time for chores, and today, lucky you, it's candle duty. You head to the workshop, a low, drafty room that smells permanently of beeswax and faintly of scorched wool. Making candles is not glamorous. It's not even that warm unless you're right up against the bubbling cauldron of wax. And standing too close means you'll spend the rest of the day trying to scrape dried wax out of your sleeves and, weirdly, your eyebrows. The process is simple but tedious. You dip wicks over and over into the melted wax, building them up layer by layer until they're thick enough to burn for a proper amount of time. It's a quiet task, repetitive, and if you squint hard enough, sort of meditative. Some historians believe candle making was a prized skill in medieval convents. Nuns were trained to produce clean-burning, even-dripping candles for religious services, and the quality of their handiwork reflected on the reputation of the abbey itself. Others argue it was just one of many exhausting domestic tasks, lumped under the vague spiritual umbrella of humble labor. Either way, you're elbow-deep in wax and very much not feeling holy. Sister Beatrice, your candle partner for the day, hums softly under her breath. You're not supposed to, but no one stops her. She's got this uncanny ability to sound like she's both in perfect pitch and half asleep. You find yourself copying her pace, dip, hold, lift, cool, repeat. It's almost hypnotic. As the hours pass, your feet start to ache, and your arms begin to feel like they're made of lead. But there's a strange comfort in the monotony. The wax has a warmth that's almost enough to chase the chill out of your hands, and occasionally the light catches the golden surface just right, turning each candle into a tiny miracle. But it's not all sweet-smelling and meditative. You glance around the workshop and notice the dark stains on the ceiling above the stove, evidence of past candle catastrophes. One sister, Sister Judith, you think once knocked over an entire pot of wax and scalded both her habit and her pride. She had to walk around smelling like burnt honey for a week. By midday, you've made enough candles to light the chapel for days. You line them up in neat rows, your fingertips sticky and faintly shiny. You resist the urge to carve your initials into one. Not that you'd be the first under candlelight. Some of those bases are suspiciously marked, possibly by rebellious teenage novices from centuries past. And now lunch. Another trip to the refectory, another round of steaming pottage, though this time it's thicker. There's even a small hunk of stale bread beside the bowl. A treat. You rip off a piece and warm it against the outside of the bowl like a pilgrim trying to resuscitate a holy relic. It's during meals like this that you notice the cold less. Not because it's warmer, but because your body has shifted into survival mode. You're no longer cold and hungry, just cold. Progress. The scripture reading continues. Today, it's Ecclesiastes, nothing like a bit of divine futility to pair with soggy bread. You listen passively, letting the words wash over you. They sound comforting, almost like white noise. Maybe that's the point. You glance down the table at the other sisters, quiet, hunched, veiled figures, each chewing in sync with the bells of their stomachs. There's an odd solidarity here in the cold and the silence. You're all doing the same impossible thing, trying to live a life of devotion, decency, and warmth in a building that's barely above refrigerator temperature. Later, as you clean your bowl with the same scrap of bread, you can't help but admire the stubborn resilience of it all. No central heating, no thick coats, no hot cocoa, just layers of wool, mutual glances of shared suffering, and the occasional candlelit blessing. One more breath out into the cold. One more blink against the gray light. And you rise again, belly full-ish, hands wax sticky and shoulders straightened under the weight of another medieval day. The afternoon arrives with a sunless shrug, and the wind picks up just enough to whistle through the cracks in the stone walls like an annoyed ghost with a grudge. You've barely finished stacking the last of the candles when Sister Agatha appears, leaning into the workshop doorway like a dramatic shadow in a habit. "Laundry," she says, her voice flat as yesterday's bread. And that's how you find yourself trudging down toward the river, dragging a wooden tub and a coarse linen sack filled with the week's laundry. The sack is suspiciously heavier than you remember. Either some sisters have been sneaking in extra shifts of clothing, or someone's smuggled in a wool blanket or two and doesn't want to admit it. The riverbank is muddy and uneven, the kind of place that makes you immediately doubt your choices in footwear, namely anything not made of rubber, which tragically hasn't been invented yet. Your leather shoes are damp within minutes, and your toes start to feel like they've been replaced with carrots that someone left in the snow. There's no boiler, of course, no detergent pods, just you, a bar of ash soap, a collection of worn garments, and the freezing river. The moment you dunk your hands in, your whole body tries to eject itself from the task. You breathe through your nose, trying to find some shred of calm in the rhythmic scrubbing. Scrub, rinse, squeeze, repeat. You can hear Sister Edwine muttering prayers beside you, either as a form of spiritual discipline or to keep her teeth from chattering. She's got a rhythm, 2-3 strokes per Hail Mary, efficient if not particularly warm. Interestingly, some historians suggest that nuns in colder regions might have had special washing arrangements, heated stone basins maybe, or access to partially enclosed spaces near kitchens where warmth from cooking fires could help a bit. Others argue that laundry was simply done less often in winter, and that acceptable filth was part of the ascetic charm. Historians still argue whether medieval convents followed strict hygienic routines or simply accepted the odor of piety as part of the package. Your own verdict is simple: the water is ice and this is a trap. There's a moment of bitter comedy when you try to wring out a particularly thick wool tunic and nearly lose your grip. It slaps back into the water like it's mad at you. Sister Edwine gives a little snort, and you both immediately pretend not to smile. Despite the misery, there's a camaraderie here. You don't talk much. Silence is a virtue, after all, but every shared wince, every exchanged glance when someone's slipper nearly slides into the river is its own quiet solidarity. Misery loves company, and laundry apparently demands it. Once the clothes are rinsed and wrung, you hang them across a sagging line strung between two crooked posts. The garments flap in the wind like spectral laundry spirits, the kind that might haunt you for improper starching. They'll take the rest of the day to dry, assuming the sun bothers to show up at all. On your way back up the hill, you pause to press your hands to your cheeks, trying to coax some life back into your fingers. They're red and stiff, like undercooked sausages, but at least you can still move them. By the time you get back to the convent, it's time for prayer again. You drop the laundry sack inside the cloister wall and head into the chapel, your breath fogging gently in front of you like an exhausted halo. Inside, it's slightly warmer, if only because the thick stone walls protect you from the wind. Candles flicker on iron sconces, casting wobbly light across the carved wooden benches and the pale stone altar. You slide into place with the rest of the sisters, your joints still stiff from the cold. The chanting begins low and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the monastery. It rolls over you like warm wool. You don't understand all of the Latin, some phrases blur into sleepy syllables, but the repetition is comforting. Predictable. Like a lullaby designed for grown-ups with sore knees and half-frozen toes. It's during moments like these that you start to understand the strange balance of hardship and peace. The cold is constant, yes. The chores are endless. But there's a structure here, a kind of blanket made of routines and ritual that keeps the chaos at bay. Still, you'd trade a solid 5 years of indulgences for a heated cushion right now. As the prayers wind down, you catch a glimpse of Sister Margaret lighting a fresh candle, the ones you dipped earlier. It flickers to life, catching the gold thread on the altar cloth. There's a strange pride in that, knowing your wax and effort helped light the room, even if your arms still feel like wax-covered noodles. Dinner comes just as the sky starts turning a darker shade of pewter. Tonight, there's lentil pottage slightly more seasoned than breakfast, thanks to a single bay leaf and the whispered rumors of garlic. It's served hot, which at this point might as well be classified as a miracle. And yes, you eat it all, even the bits that taste faintly of pot bottom. Afterward, you help clean the bowls. You're on scullery duty, which means rinsing out earthenware with frigid water and a cloth that might once have been a towel. No soap, no sponge. Just elbow grease and the haunting knowledge that the same bowl might serve someone else tomorrow. By the time you finish, your sleeves are soaked, your back aches, and you've begun seriously contemplating whether the ascetic lifestyle came with a return policy. Still, there's something about stepping back into the cold night air and seeing your breath rise with a belly full of something warm, even if it was mushy lentils, that makes you feel weirdly victorious. The stars are starting to peek out sharp, glittering pinpricks in the black velvet of the sky. The wind carries the scent of wood smoke and sheep. Somewhere a bell tolls softly, calling you back to the dormitory. Another day nearly done. You tug your habit closer around you and start the slow, careful walk back to your cell. The cold bites a little less. Your limbs are heavy, but in that good worked-all-day kind of way. And your breath fogs quietly in the night air, like a secret being shared with the sky. Sleep doesn't come easily in a stone room with no heat, no insulation, and a straw-stuffed mattress that crinkles like it's judging your every move. You lie there wrapped like a poorly folded parcel in your scratchy woolen blanket, trying not to focus on the breeze snaking through the tiny window slit above your cot. Your breath puffs out in delicate clouds, and you start to wonder if nuns in colder regions ever woke up with ice on their eyebrows. Spoiler alert, some did. There are reports from particularly harsh winters where frost formed on the insides of walls and bedding. So yes, you could literally freeze your prayers off. The convent isn't generous with firewood, and you don't get your own hearth. Fires are for the communal kitchen, the chapel when necessary, and the refectory on holidays maybe. Historians still argue whether individual cells were ever heated in wealthier convents, but for your purposes, it's strictly BYOB. Bring your own body heat. So you layer. You pull your woolen shift tighter, keep your socks on, which might technically violate the rule of St. Benedict's guidelines about sleeping in simple garments, but who's checking and press your freezing fingers under your armpits like a squirrel hoarding warmth. Now here's where things get creative. Despite what your imagination might insist, medieval nuns weren't just stoic ice statues who endured the cold through sheer willpower and divine favor. They had tricks. Some tucked hot stones warmed at the edge of the kitchen hearth into cloth pouches and placed them at their feet. Others wore sleeping hoods which looked like something between a bonnet and a sock puppet. Not glamorous, but effective. And then there's the most controversial method, body heat, shared warmth. It's never officially written into convent rules, of course, but oral histories, letters, and a few scandalous records suggest that companion sleeping happened more often than people like to admit. Not for scandal, though, you'd be forgiven for raising an eyebrow, but simply for survival. If it's between freezing solid in your sleep or cuddling up to Sister Beatrix like she's a human fireplace, the choice becomes pretty obvious. Some modern historians lean into this idea, suggesting it was more widespread than previously believed. Others are skeptical, arguing that it would clash too hard with vows of chastity and strict personal boundaries. Historians still argue whether shared sleeping arrangements were common acts of sisterly survival or rare breaches of cloistered decorum. You in this freezing cell are leaning strongly toward sisterly survival. But tonight you're alone. Just you, a rapidly cooling mattress, and the faint creak of wood settling somewhere down the hall. You try to get comfortable rotating between fetal position and mummy in mild distress. Nothing works. Eventually, you resort to prayer, not the high-minded poetic stuff. Just something like, "Please God, warm my feet, or take them. Amen." Time becomes a strange thing in the dark. You drift in and out, waking with your teeth clenched, dreaming of hot soup or heated blankets that don't exist. At some point, you swear you hear a mouse sneeze. The bell rings at some ungodly hour, literally ungodly. It's still pitch black outside, which means it's time for vigils, your early morning prayer service. You peel yourself from the mattress like a strip of frozen bacon and layer up again. The corridors are silent as you shuffle through them, breath fogging in front of you, and your footsteps muffled by worn soles. The other sisters move like ghosts half asleep, draped in shawls and habits. No one talks. No one needs to. You all understand the unspoken agreement. Do the prayers, pretend you're spiritually refreshed, and maybe get back to sleep before your soul gives up entirely. The chapel is even colder than your cell, which seems like a betrayal. You kneel, trying not to wince as your joints crack like ancient doors. The prayers begin gentle chanting that fills the space with warmth, even if the air stays icy. There's something about this moment that feels still. You're not thinking about food or fire or even your toes, which have now gone suspiciously numb. You're just breathing, kneeling, listening to voices rise in slow, layered waves. If you weren't half frozen and delirious with exhaustion, you might even call it beautiful. After the service, you get an hour, maybe two, of rest before dawn truly breaks. You return to your cell this time, sliding under the covers with a tiny ceramic stone you smuggled from the hearth earlier. It's not hot anymore, but it's not cold, and that's honestly enough. By morning, you're woken not by a bell, but by light. A shaft of pale gold slips through the window slit and lands squarely on your face like an accusatory finger. Time to begin again. You stretch slowly, cracking everything that can crack and reach for your shoes. They're stiff and unforgiving, the leather having decided to solidify overnight. You sigh, slipping them on anyway. Outside, the air has softened just a little. The kind of less cold that makes you feel weirdly triumphant. Like nature's trying to apologize but isn't sure how. Birds chirp angrily because they're also freezing, but it's a sound you haven't heard in days. As you walk toward the kitchen for breakfast, you pass Sister Agatha again. She's carrying a bundle of herbs, probably for the infirmary, or maybe for adding to today's gruel. She raises an eyebrow at your stiff-legged hobble. "Sleep well," she asks deadpan. "Like a blessed icicle," you mutter. She snorts softly, then keeps walking. You smile to yourself. Because as much as you're still cold and tired, and more than a little grumpy, there's a weird comfort in the rhythm of it all. The cold may be relentless, but so are you. And that apparently is half the point. Back in the kitchen, you spot the simmering pot, more lentils naturally, and a small stack of yesterday's bread toasted on one side where someone got creative with the fire poker. You pour a bowl and settle onto a bench. Someone's added a pinch of herbs basil, maybe. No too fancy. More likely dried dandelion. Still, it tastes different, and different is good. You wrap your hands around the bowl, letting the heat seep into your bones. Around you, the sisters eat quietly, heads bowed, steam rising like a silent hymn. Another day has begun. The sun never really shines the way you'd hope. Instead of golden warmth pouring through stained glass windows, it's more like a smudge of gray light smeared across the sky. You squint at it through the refectory window while rinsing your wooden bowl at the water basin, trying to remember what actual sunlight feels like. Your hands sting from the cold water, and you wince. Warmth is a luxury item here, rationed, bargained for, creatively sourced. And you're starting to realize how clever the sisters have become at navigating that chill without breaking their vows or their backs. Take, for example, the miracle of the Nuns layering system. You think you've mastered winter fashion because you own a heated jacket and fuzzy socks. But these women, they're working with linen wool and pure determination. You notice Sister Marta nearby bundling herself in what seems like 3 cloaks sewn into one. Her look is half bear, half blanket, but it's effective. She gives you a small nod, her cheeks ruddy from the wind outside. The layers are all about smart order linen undergarments closest to the skin to wick away moisture, then a woolen shift thicker, sometimes patched with scrap cloth, always itchy. Over that, a sleeveless surcoat or scapular long and boxy, topped off by a cloak hood, and maybe even mittens stitched from old habits. If you're lucky, someone in the convent is handy with fleece lining from sheared sheep, but let's be honest, most of what you wear was someone else's death robe last season. And speaking of cloaks, you've learned not all are created equal. Some convents receive donations from wealthy patrons, often in the form of textiles, so it wasn't unheard of for the abbess to own a cloak with decorative trim or imported dye, subtle of course, but still a flex. Historians still argue whether these cloaks were considered humble enough to wear, or if they stayed tucked away in storage until papal visits or funerals. Either way, you're not wearing one. You're in plain brown wool, patched on the elbows, smelling faintly of old turnips and incense. You head outside for morning duties, trying not to curse the wind as it hits you square in the face. Your breath comes out in huffs that mimic the grumbles in your stomach. Winter work is not for the weak, and it doesn't care that you didn't sleep well. First, stop the herb garden. Yes, it still needs tending even in winter. You crouch next to a bed of evergreen herbs, rosemary thyme, maybe a brave mint leaf or two, and begin brushing away frost and clearing dead stems. A tiny robin watches you from the fence post, unimpressed. The thing is, medieval nuns weren't just spiritual leaders. They were herbalists, midwives, and medicinal tinkerers. Keeping warm often had less to do with fire and more to do with what you rubbed on your skin or sipped from a cup. Clove, sage, mustard seeds, these weren't just for flavor. They were warmth in a jar, Sister Ameline passes by, her arms full of jars clinking like glass bells. She's heading toward the warming room, which, yes, it exists, but don't get too excited. It's about the size of a walk-in closet and barely warmer than the hallway. Still, it's the designated space for drying damp clothes and warming chilled fingers between tasks. You join her curious. Inside, a small brazier sits in the corner, burning low. The air smells like damp wool and elderflower salve. You hang your gloves on a peg and huddle close, basking in what might generously be called less cold. There's a sense of quiet camaraderie here. The sisters rotate in and out, never staying too long, always conscious that heat is borrowed, never owned. They chat softly, murmuring about weather predictions based on clouds and the way the milk curdled that morning, the health of the old dog who guards the convent gate, and whether the bishop's next visit will mean an extra egg at breakfast. Someone mentions a miracle one of the sisters cured of a chill-related cough after rubbing her chest with crushed garlic and sheep tallow. You suppress a gag but file the info away. Desperate times. And if garlic doesn't work, there's always the brick trick. A classic. You take a brick, warm it in the fire, wrap it in cloth, and shove it under your robes like a mobile heat pack. You consider trying it tonight, provided you don't accidentally burn your leg off. Historians still argue whether these daily warming rituals counted as indulgence or survival, especially in stricter orders. Was seeking heat a sign of physical weakness or just practical good sense? It's hard to say. You lean toward good sense, especially since your toes haven't fully thawed since October. Later, as you help stir a pot of something that may or may not be soup, the recipe seems to be find something edible and boil it. You reflect on how survival is stitched into everything here. From clothing to habits to quiet hacks, like hiding warmed stones in your habit's deep pockets. One nun once wrote about sewing tiny pockets into her sleeves to smuggle fire-heated pebbles into prayer like the world's most devout hand-warmers. Genius. Slightly dangerous, but genius. You grab a spoon, stir the pot, and try to imagine explaining any of this to someone from your century. So we didn't have space heaters, but we had secret sleeve pebbles and garlic grease massages. It was basically the same thing. They'd laugh, but you know better now. As the day ends, and you return to your cell, you notice the way the wool of your cloak holds heat a little longer now, like it's learned your shape. The scratchiness is still there, but it's almost comforting, a physical reminder that yes, you've survived another day in a world that doesn't care about comfort, but demands perseverance anyway. You light a small taper enough to see by. The stone walls catch the flicker in a way that's almost beautiful. Not warm exactly, but not as cold as it could be. You blow out the flame, wrap yourself in layers, tuck your knees in your chin down, whisper a short prayer that might have been written centuries ago, or might have just come from your tired lips. And as you begin to drift, you make a note tomorrow. Ask Sister Ameline if you can borrow that sheep tallow. Garlic or not, your toes are worth it. You wake to the sound of the wooden bell clapper thudding against the side of the chapel's tower. It's not a jarring noise, more like a distant heartbeat, deep and dull, but it reminds you that it's freezing and that it's time to move again. You groan quietly, limbs stiff-wrapped burrito style in layers of wool that you now understand to be medieval life support. You swing your legs out of the cot and touch cold stone with bare toes. It's a mistake. You gasp, then yank them back up and hurriedly slip on your stockings, which were tucked under your tunic to keep warm overnight. That trick Sister Marta told you is a centuries-old hack. Not everyone had a personal fire, so you slept with tomorrow's clothes pressed against your body like treasured relics. Your breath puffs visibly in your little cell, forming halos of mist before it fades. This isn't an exaggeration. It's the actual morning ritual. Shiver, mutter, layer, pray. Today, you're joining the sisters in one of their most delicate balancing acts, staying warm without drawing attention to yourself, or giving in to sinful self-comfort. That might sound dramatic, but when your life is built around vows of poverty and modesty, even holding your hands too close to a flame starts to feel suspiciously cozy. The convent's rules, drafted long ago and endlessly debated, don't technically forbid warmth, but they do draw the line at luxury. So if it feels too nice, too comforting, you might be skating into indulgence territory. And nobody wants to be the nun who got scolded for loving a hot bath too much. Speaking of baths, you're due for one today. You've been warned. The bathhouse isn't exactly the spa retreat you might be picturing. It's a wooden shed tucked behind the main building, drafty and dim, with a single large wooden tub and a tiny corner hearth barely clinging to life. You get maybe one bath a week, if that, and even then it's more like lukewarm sponge time with an audience of silent, equally embarrassed women. You trudge there after breakfast, your breath steaming like a kettle as you move. The path is slippery with frost, and your boots crunch over the gravel. You mutter a little modern-day complaint under your breath, just loud enough that only the convent chickens hear you. Once inside the bathhouse, you remove your layers down to a linen shift, still modest, still covering more than your swimsuit ever did. You step into the tub and brace for impact. The water's not freezing, but it isn't warm either. It's something between glacial river and could be worse. Your skin prickles as you lower yourself in, and you swear you hear the bones in your spine mutter a tiny scream. The other nuns are quiet. There's an unspoken rule here: don't complain. Suffering in silence earns virtue points, and honestly, nobody wants to break the illusion that this is a peaceful, pious moment. You smile at Sister Agatha, who responds with a look that says, "We both hate this, but we're too holy to admit it." You scrub quickly using a bar of homemade soap that smells faintly of lavender and lard. Another nun passes you a cloth, and you scrub your feet, wincing when the fabric grazes a blister from your too small shoes. Foot health is not a medieval strong suit. As you towel off with what is technically just another piece of linen, you overhear a discussion about warming stones. Apparently, some of the older sisters sleep with river rocks heated in the hearth, wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath their cots. Then about whether it's too indulgent to do so regularly. Historians still argue whether warming stones were allowed in Benedictine orders, Sister Ameline says, raising an eyebrow. But I say, if the stone doesn't burn a hole in your mattress, God probably won't mind. You nod sagely, though internally you're thinking, next time I'm getting 2 stones. Outside, the wind howls again, and your breath is stolen before you can even sigh. You pull your cloak tighter and follow the group toward the laundry house, because today is also washing day naturally. Washing day is just as bleak as it sounds. It involves large cauldrons of water fires that refuse to light and fingers that stay red for hours. You stir garments with a wooden paddle, a witch brewing a cauldron of wool and soap and frozen dreams. The water is gray and thick with suds. Pieces of cloth slap wetly against the sides of the tubs. Occasionally a joke passes between sisters, low and dry as the wind. Someone pretends to wring out a tunic and then twists it dramatically like a theatrical villain. You laugh, but your hands are so cold you don't feel your fingers. Still, it's this daily misery that bonds you. There's something weirdly comforting about mutual suffering. You're not alone in the cold, and maybe that makes it less unbearable. The nuns don't complain not because they don't feel it, but because they've made peace with discomfort. They've woven it into their faith. You glance around and realize that many of them are singing softly. A hymn, quiet and breathy, floats over the steaming basins. It's not about warmth. It's about endurance, grace, and the idea that even misery can be beautiful when shared. Later that afternoon, you're finally inside, peeling off wet gloves and hanging them by the small kitchen hearth. The fire crackles, spitting tiny sparks that blink and vanish. You stand close, just close enough to warm your palms without crossing any invisible line of indulgence. Nearby, Sister Agnes wraps a woolen scarf around her neck. I always ask myself, she murmurs, would the Virgin Mary allow herself a second scarf? You blink, not sure if she's joking. Then she winks. She is joking. You breathe a soft laugh and decide it's okay to smile here. Humor survives even in icy monasteries. And sometimes so does creativity. You've seen sisters stitch scraps of wool into secret compartments in their sleeves. One nun keeps a tiny pouch of hot herbs pressed against her chest. Another folds straw into the soles of her shoes for insulation. These hacks aren't officially allowed, but they're not exactly forbidden either. Historians still argue whether these unauthorized comforts were widespread or just tolerated by especially chill abbesses. Pun fully intended. What's clear is that you're surrounded by some truly resourceful women who've been hacking the cold long before TikTok tips and heated blankets existed. That night, you return to your cell clutching your linen tunic freshly warmed by the fire. You shake out the sleeves and sigh, grateful for small mercies. Maybe you'll try the straw in the shoe trick tomorrow. Maybe you'll survive the winter after all. You're not sure what wakes you, maybe the sound of wind creeping through the cracks in the stone wall or the low creak of ancient wood beams settling above you. Either way, your body aches with that dull, familiar cold, the kind that seeps into your bones like a quiet but relentless houseguest. Still, it's time to get up. And this morning you're headed into a different kind of challenge chores in the freezing open air. Yes, today you're on garden duty. You dress quickly, layering your tunic, over-tunic hood, and wool cloak with the precision of a medieval onion. Your fingers fumble with the knot on your rope belt, and you already regret not warming it first. The moment you step outside, the chill slices through your sleeves like a blade made of fog. The convent's vegetable garden might not seem like a survival zone, but in winter, it's a battlefield of frostbitten soil and half-dead root vegetables. You're handed a rusted hoe and pointed toward a patch of cabbages that look like they've given up on life. These will become soup tonight, assuming you can extract them from the frozen ground. You kneel on a woven mat, Sister Anselma's clever invention, to prevent frostbite, and get to work your breath puffing in rhythm with each grunt of effort. The soil isn't completely frozen, but it's stiff and uncooperative like a toddler mid-tantrum. Still, you manage to dislodge a few pathetic-looking turnips and one defiant carrot. Make peace with root vegetables, one of the sisters says as she passes, holding a wicker basket full of the same sad produce. They don't complain, and they store well. That's medieval culinary optimism for you. While your body works, your mind wanders, and you start to think about how the nuns got through entire winters without modern heating. They didn't have central fireplaces or thermal socks, or those adorable mini space heaters shaped like cartoon animals. No, they had a system that was as much spiritual as it was practical. The convent was designed for passive heat. Thick stone walls held in whatever warmth the hearth produced. Smaller rooms were easier to keep warm, so the sisters didn't hang out in cavernous halls unless absolutely necessary. And they always kept moving. Activity was its own kind of heating element. But the real secret weapon shared body heat. That's right. When it got really cold, like nose-freezing, finger-numbing cold, sisters would sleep in pairs. It was controversial and not always officially acknowledged, but it happened. Historians still argue whether shared bedding was a sanctioned act of practicality or an uncomfortable moral gray area. The abbess once muttered, clearly quoting something she'd read and half regretted remembering. You chip at the ground a bit harder, wondering how awkward that conversation must have been. Pardon me, Sister Agnes, but may I borrow your elbow for insulation? Hardly pillow talk. Still, you get it now. Cold changes everything. It makes you more forgiving, less proud. It humbles even the most pious of women. You take a break and sit on a tree stump, your hands wrapped around a cup of thin broth. It's hot at least, and it warms your palms through the wooden bowl. You sip grateful and glance at the others around you. Everyone's bundled and silent steam rising from bowls like halos. Then one nun lets out a sneeze so loud it echoes off the stone wall. The silence breaks into soft chuckles. Bless you, someone says automatically. Bless this weather, the sneezer mutters, because clearly it's the devil's favorite. Laughter ripples small and quiet, but very real. After garden duty, you help bring in firewood from the storage shed. It's a grim march back and forth, hauling bundles of damp logs that leave splinters in your gloves. Still, you notice how the older nuns know exactly how to stack them to maximize drying time and airflow. There's a science here. Generations of passed-down knowledge tucked between the bark. Some of the younger novices whisper about their secret fantasy, finding a way to smuggle in hot bricks under their robes. Sister Clara once tried it. She scorched a hole in her habit and nearly burned a prayer book. The abbess was not amused. But the desperation for heat can make you inventive. One sister uses waxed cloth to block wind around her cell window. Another places her boots upside down by the hearth to let warm air pool inside them. You're learning. Slowly, you're becoming a functional cold-weather nun. That night at dinner, everyone huddles in the refectory, shoulders nearly touching. The fire blazes in the hearth and a pot of stew bubbles gently above it. You're handed a bowl and some crusty bread that could probably survive a siege. It's not glamorous, but it's warm. And somehow sitting elbow to elbow surrounded by people who've been just as miserable as you all day, it's perfect. You listen as one of the older sisters reads aloud from a manuscript. Her voice is steady, calm, and slightly amused, especially when she hits a passage about how true virtue is tested not in peace, but in hardship. She raises an eyebrow as she looks around the room. No one speaks, but several nod. Later in the common room, there's sewing by candlelight. You're stitching a patch onto a worn wool sock, and one of the sisters shows you how to double knot the thread so it won't unravel mid-blizzard. She's got 3 extra layers on, and a wimple that's seen better centuries. But she's smiling. A small debate begins about whether St. Bridget ever used wool-lined sandals. Historians still argue whether she walked barefoot all winter in Ireland, someone jokes, or whether she just had really thick calluses. You giggle, trying not to stab yourself with the needle. Humor your learning is another insulation method. And maybe holiness isn't about total self-denial. It's about enduring discomfort with grace and the occasional well-timed joke. When it's finally bedtime, you slip under your blanket, now supplemented with a folded-up cloak you accidentally didn't hang back in the cloakroom. Your straw mattress creaks, and you curl up, tight hands tucked into your sleeves, your nose cold, but your heart weirdly warm. You're beginning to understand something essential. Medieval nuns didn't survive winter through rules alone. They survived it through each other, through creativity, compromise, tiny comforts, and stubborn faith. And you're still here, still freezing, but maybe, just maybe, not quite as miserable. By the time morning tiptoes across the convent courtyard again, you're already half awake, thanks to a rogue draft that somehow found the 1 millimeter of exposed skin on your ankle. But you roll out of bed anyway, feeling like a human-shaped icicle wrapped in wool and resolve. Today's assigned task, laundry. And not the warm, fluffy, dryer-laden kind you're used to. No, this is medieval laundry, which means dragging frozen linens, buckets of icy water, and your own shivering self to the wash house, a place so damp it probably has its own weather system. The nuns here have turned laundering into an art form, one involving ash lye soap, elbow grease, and what can only be described as a cold water baptism for your fingers. You grit your teeth, plunge your hands into the bucket, and instantly question every decision that led to this moment. The soap's made from wood ash and leftover animal fat, boiled and strained until it becomes a thick gray paste. It smells like old bacon and smoke, and you smear it over the cloth like you're frosting the world's least appetizing cake. Your fingers are already stiff, and the fabric feels more like chainmail than linen. Across from you, Sister Magdalene hums a tune, her hands working in rhythm as she scrubs with impossible speed. "Keep moving," she says, with a smile that suggests she's done this in snowstorms. Stillness is the enemy. That line could honestly be the convent's motto. And sure, it's horrible, but the truth is, keeping busy does help. The rhythm, the motion, even the shared misery, there's something numbly comforting about it. You start to fall into step, your breath forming little clouds with every exhale as you wring out another sheet, then another. Washing was often a group task for medieval nuns, especially in colder months. Cloisters operated like tiny ecosystems, with each chore designed to keep both souls and bodies in check. Clean linens weren't just about hygiene, they symbolized internal purity, which, if you think about it too hard while knee-deep in freezing water, is mildly ironic. Historians still argue whether laundry was considered penitential labor or just a grim necessity. Sister Magdalene tells you, her voice light, despite the frost collecting on her eyebrows. But either way, we do it with joy, or pretend to. A few younger novices sneak glances at you, grinning like this is some secret initiation. And maybe it is. Everyone has their trial-by-water moment. This is yours. Once the linens are washed, they're wrung out by hand, wrung so hard your palms feel like they've been flattened, and then carried to the drying line. You head outside with your arms full of damp cloth, which immediately begins to freeze into odd, stiff shapes. The nuns joke that it looks like ghosts waving in the wind. You start to agree once one of the pillowcases flutters at you like it's plotting revenge. Back inside, there's a short break, just long enough to warm up by the hearth. Someone passes around dried apple slices and a tiny wedge of cheese. It's not a feast, but it's enough to keep the chill from claiming your bones completely. The topic of the moment: alternative heating strategies. One sister swears by stuffing dried moss into her boots. Another claims she once heated a brick in the oven and wrapped it in cloth, then tucked it under her scapular like a hot water bottle. She looks smug until another nun reminds her that same brick scorched the hem of her habit. Ah, yes, the ancient medieval dilemma: warmth or wardrobe. You hear someone mention warming stones used in wealthier households. They'd heat flat rocks in the fire and tuck them into bedding, one nun says wistfully. Historians still argue whether convents ever adopted the practice or whether it was deemed too indulgent. In this convent, indulgence is relative. Adding an extra layer of straw to your bed is considered innovative. Sneaking two hoods on at once, that's advanced strategy. Heating stones would probably be considered luxury, bordering on spiritual danger. Still, you find yourself daydreaming about it, holding a warm stone like a sleepy kitten, cradling it beneath your blanket, feeling the blessed heat seep into your spine. But for now, you settle for tea made from mint leaves steeped in warm water. It's barely flavored, but it feels like nectar from the gods as it rolls down your throat. Later, there's time set aside for needlework. You work slowly, still thawing from laundry duty. One of the sisters teaches you how to darn a sock using a wooden mushroom tucked inside to mimic a heel. It's oddly meditative. You fall into the rhythm: stab, pull, loop, tighten. Stab, pull, loop, tighten. You're starting to realize something else: these small tasks, as monotonous as they are, offer their own kind of warmth. They anchor your day, give your fingers purpose, and distract you from the fact that you haven't been properly warm in, well, weeks. By late afternoon, the sun peeks through the narrow convent windows, casting golden shafts of light that look warmer than they actually are. One sister jokes that sunlight is like a cat. You love it, but it only comes when it wants to. Everyone laughs softly. You're starting to laugh with them more often. In the evening after Vespers, the fire is restoked, and everyone gathers in the warming room, a modest chamber where the heat from the day is collected like precious treasure. You sit close to the stone hearth, the smoke curling upward, the light flickering against your face. You can't feel your toes, but your heart is full. The abbess reads a passage from a devotional about humility and suffering. Her voice is low-measured. She pauses on the line, "Let the cold teach you patience, and the fire remind you of grace." You don't know who wrote it, but it hits you right in your frost-numbed soul. That night, you lay under your pile of blankets, cloaks, and creatively repurposed curtain fabric. Your limbs ache, your hands are red, but your body has that exhausted heaviness that comes after a long day of work. The convent may not have central heating, but it has something better: rhythm in tension and strange, stubborn warmth shared between the women who keep showing up day after day, frost after frost. You yawn. One of the sisters mumbles in her sleep. Someone else turns over with a loud sigh, and you smile into your itchy pillowcase. You've survived laundry day. That in this place is basically sainthood. The sun isn't quite up yet, but already the convent buzzes with the quiet rustlings of habit and routine. You wake slowly sore in strange new places. Muscles you didn't know existed now remind you that scrubbing laundry by hand is not a medieval spa treatment. Still, there's something oddly comforting in the stiffness. You've earned that soreness, one frigid, soap-slathered sheet at a time. Today, though, there's a different rhythm in the air. You're told it's maintenance day, which sounds deceptively modern, until you realize it involves checking the insulation of the dormitory, namely the straw-stuffed walls and rush-covered floors. You're handed a broom made of bundled twigs tied with cord and told to help sweep out the old floor rushes. The old rushes are brittle, musty, and speckled with crumbs and mouse. Let's call them remnants. You fight the urge to sneeze and get to work, trying not to imagine the micro-kingdoms you're disturbing. Medieval homes, and yes, convents too, used floor rushes as insulation and rudimentary carpeting. In wealthier places, these were layered with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the smell. Here, it's more a matter of practicality than perfume. You're just happy it's not frozen mud. Historians still argue whether rush replacement was seasonal or only done during major feasts. A sister murmurs beside you as she swings her own broom with surprising ferocity. We do it quarterly, but there's always debate. The debate seems largely based on how many mice are spotted in the refectory each week. Once the old rushes are cleared, fresh bundles are brought in long, pale green reeds, still slightly damp from their recent harvest. You help lay them carefully across the stone floor. It's a bit like unrolling shag carpet, only if the carpet were alive and smelled faintly of pond. You're told the new rushes help keep heat in, especially on the lower levels where feet meet frost. And they do add a soft crunch underfoot, something different from the cold, unyielding stone. Later in the kitchens, there's talk of warming the bread oven. Now that's a phrase you can get behind. It turns out the convent doesn't just bake bread. They use the residual heat from the massive stone oven to warm other rooms, sometimes even tucking clay pots of hot embers into cold corners of the convent. Once the bread's out, the oven still radiates for hours, says Sister Clara, as she gently places a loaf on a wooden board. We leave the kitchen doors open just a crack to share the warmth. It's the convent version of a fireplace. You stand near the oven for as long as you can without looking suspicious, letting the waves of delicious yeasty heat soak into your bones. One sister tells you about a trick she learned as a novice, heating small pebbles in the corner of the oven, then tucking them into cloth bags to slip under her blankets at night. Not quite a hot water bottle, she says with a wink, but it keeps the frostbite at bay. Again, the unofficial convent motto, it's not indulgent if it stops you from dying. As you help carry loaves to the refectory, you pass by a group of sisters spinning wool. They sit in a semicircle near the fire distaffs in hand, twisting and teasing fibers with practiced ease. You're waved over and handed a spindle, not because anyone expects you to be good at it, but because everyone starts somewhere, even if it's terrible. You begin spinning. It's awful. Your thread is uneven, lumpy, and keeps snapping. But it's also hypnotic. The rhythm of fingers, the quiet hum of the wheel, the soft brushing of wool, it wraps around your brain like a lullaby. Wool garments were a convent essential. Warm, durable, and relatively easy to produce wool kept the cold from seeping in too deeply. Nuns spun, wove, and mended almost everything themselves, creating layer after layer of protection from the creeping chill. Someone explains the layering system: an under-tunic, then a heavier tunic, a scapular over that, and a cloak if you were lucky or cold enough to justify it. The idea was to trap heat, not flaunt fashion, though one sister admits she once sewed fleece into her scapular by accident, which earned her a silent nod of admiration from the group. Historians still argue whether convent dress codes were stricter in winter. Someone adds thoughtfully, twisting wool into a perfect little spool. Some orders permitted mittens, others saw them as vanity. You look at your own red, raw hands and can't imagine choosing modesty over mittens. But hey, different vows for different folks. By mid-afternoon, you're helping to patch the north wall with wattle and daub, a charming medieval combo of sticks, clay, and straw. The idea is to keep the biting wind out, but as you smear cold mud between the wooden slats, you're not sure whether the wind is biting you or mocking you. The work is satisfying in its own way. Your hands are filthy, your arms ache, and your shoes have become part of the mud itself. But when the wind stops whistling through that patch of wall, you feel like you've won a tiny, muddy war. After Vespers, during the quiet candlelit time before bed, you help distribute bed warmers, flat pans filled with coals, slid under pallets to preheat them. It's an occasional luxury saved for nights when the frost creeps in early. You're given one to carry the metal warm but not scorching, and as you place it beneath your sleeping mat, it feels like a promise you might actually fall asleep warm tonight. As you climb into your blanket mountain, you think of all the strategies employed to fight off the medieval chill, some clever, some questionable, some a little gross. From moss in boots to hot bricks, these women have turned warming into a holy science. And somehow amidst all the freezing, there's laughter. Jokes about socks going missing in the laundry. Tall tales about who managed to sneak the last ember from the kitchen oven. Soft snoring and the rustle of someone turning in bed. You fall asleep wondering what tomorrow's chill will bring and what warmth the sisters will conjure in response. You wake to an unexpected luxury, your toes aren't frozen. This is either divine intervention or the hot coal pan actually worked. Either way, you're calling it a win. The convent bell rings low and slow, the kind of tone that doesn't so much wake you up as it drifts through your bones until your body gives up pretending it's asleep. You stretch under the wool layers, trying to decide if you're sore from yesterday's mud-smearing broom swinging or just life. Probably all of the above. You rise brush straw off your tunic and shuffle toward the morning gathering. Today, you're told, is bath day. Your eyes go wide, unsure if you should feel hopeful or horrified. Bathing in the medieval convent is not what you might imagine. There's no bubble bath, no lavender-scented salts, and definitely no waterproof Bluetooth speaker playing Gregorian chant remixes. Just a wooden tub water that is sometimes warm and a strict rotation schedule. Don't worry, says Sister Agnes with a wink. You get used to the cold and the smell. You try not to take that personally. The tub sits in a corner of the warming room, a rare heated space in the convent that doubles as a place to dry herbs, parch grains, and occasionally roast oneself alive next to the fire. The water's been carried by hand pot after steaming pot and dumped into the barrel-sized bath. The smell is, well, it's not great. A sort of mossy mineral soup aroma that suggests at least 3 nuns bathed in it before you. Still, you strip to your shift and lower yourself in with a hiss and a shiver. The heat feels glorious for about 12 seconds. Then the chill sets in, water cooling faster than your body can soak up its fleeting warmth. Baths were infrequent in medieval convents, usually reserved for special occasions or sheer necessity. Historians still argue whether bathing was considered vanity or hygiene, one sister mutters as she braids her damp hair, but most of us just think it's a miracle when it happens. Once you're sufficiently prune-like, you're handed a coarse linen cloth and a jar of soapwort paste. It smells like overcooked spinach and works like sandpaper. You scrub, you regret. But your skin has never felt so exfoliated. Wrapped in your cloak, you shuffle back to your work assignment mending. specifically patching worn socks and tunics with needle and thread. You sit beside a nun who sews with such speed and precision, it makes you question every home economics class you ever took. "You'll need warm socks if you're going out today," she says, gesturing toward a pile of wool. "They've got you on firewood duty." You gulp, of course they do. Armed with a rough cloak and your freshly darned socks, you join a small group heading toward the convent's woodpile. The wind slices through your layers like judgment. Every breath feels like it has teeth. Collecting firewood is a brutal, freezing, splinter-filled affair. You try to be useful, hauling stacking, bracing logs against your hip like a medieval lumberjack, but mostly you just struggle to keep your nose from turning blue. Nuns needed wood for everything: heating, cooking, and boiling water for washing or dyeing fabric. It was precious and rationed. You learn to sort the logs softwood for kindling, hardwood for lasting heat. You even find yourself rating branches for burn appeal, which is both ridiculous and entirely necessary. While working, one sister tells you about how some convents used peat instead of wood. "It burns slow and stinks worse than Brother Hugo's sandals," she says, which earns a few knowing groans. Apparently, Brother Hugo is legendary for reasons best left unexplored. You haul back what you can carry: arms-scratched cloak dusted with bark flakes, and stack the wood neatly near the kitchen. There's a brief moment where you admire your pile like it's a masterpiece, or at least something that won't collapse on a nun in the dark. Back inside, the air feels warm by comparison. You kneel beside the fire not out of devotion, but to thaw your fingers. Another nun hands you a cup of warm barley tea. It's earthy and bitter, like if toast had feelings, but it helps. Someone starts reciting part of the Rule of Saint Benedict, the guiding text of monastic life. One passage sticks with you. "Let the strong have something to strive for, and the weak nothing to run from." You nod mostly because you feel like both the strong and the weak, depending on whether you're hauling logs or folding socks. The rest of the day passes in a haze of fabric fire and the faintest sense of contentment. You sew alongside the sisters, pausing now and then to stretch your back or crack a smile at someone's crooked embroidery. The cloistered silence is occasionally broken by laughter or a cough, or the soft plunk of wood settling on the hearth. Evening draws near, and with it, the temperature dips. You're ushered toward the dormitory again, where fresh rushes now feel less like crunchy weeds and more like luxury flooring. Before lights out, the nuns pass around stones heated near the oven, small palm-sized smooth things wrapped in wool. You tuck one under your blanket, your own miniature hearth. You lie there listening to the crackle of firewood in the next room, the slow creak of beams settling in the cold, and the occasional whisper of prayers half murmured in dreams. Funny you think how these women, constrained by vows and stone walls, have crafted a kind of warmth that runs deeper than wool. It's not just survival, it's something more intentional, a practiced comfort, a daily act of care woven through routine patience and the quiet power of community. You let your fingers curl around the warm stone, the heat a small defiance against the creeping cold, and somehow for the first time all day you realize you're not cold anymore. Morning slips in like a draft under the door, slow, cold, and impossible to ignore. You open your eyes to the familiar dim light seeping through slitted windows, the faint breath of other nuns in their sleep still hovering in the air like tiny clouds. You stretch just enough to hear a few bones crack back into alignment, then sit up and press your feet to the stone floor. Yep, still cold. A little less than before, maybe, but that might just be your nerves going numb. Today, you're assigned to the scriptorium. That's right, the big leagues. The sacred space where books are copied, prayers become parchment, and silence is enforced like it's sacred currency. You shuffle there after morning prayers, your wool robe catching the soft golden light that begins to glow along the corridor walls. The scriptorium is warmer than most rooms. Monks and nuns throughout the Middle Ages knew that cold ink didn't flow well, so fires were carefully maintained nearby. But not too near, of course. Books and flames are not friends. Just ask anyone who's knocked over a candle during Vespers. Inside the scriptorium is hushed, thick with focus. You hear only the scratching of quills on parchment, the occasional throat clearing, and the soft rustle of pages turned with reverence. A nun gestures for you to sit at a modest wooden desk. On it, a sharpened feather quill, a chunk of ink made from oak gall and iron salts, and a partially copied page of Latin prayers. No pressure, right? You dip the quill and immediately blot a big splash of ink across the page. One of the older nuns sighs so gently it sounds like a breeze. You try again, slower this time. The quill drags over the parchment like a cat with attitude, but you manage a passable line of script. Most convents during the Middle Ages valued literacy, especially when it served the church. Scribes could spend weeks or even months on a single book. And though monks did the bulk of the copying in many places, female scribes weren't rare. Some nuns were master illuminators illustrating the margins of books, with plants, animals, saints, and occasionally a mischievous bunny jousting a snail. You can't make that up. Well, someone did, but it wasn't you. Historians still argue whether these playful drawings were acts of quiet rebellion or spiritual symbolism, the head scribe whispers, as she walks by, hands clasped behind her back. I like to think we were just bored. You nod solemnly. The truth is, boredom might be your greatest trial here. Between the cold, the strict silence, and the tiny repetitive movements of lettering, your mind begins to wander. You imagine what the ink tastes like. You wonder if Sister Clara has a secret stash of biscuits. You swear the nun across from you just wrote an entire sentence without blinking. Just when you're about to start adding cartoon dragons to the margins, you're relieved from your post. Time for candle duty. You follow Sister Beatrix to the workshop where bundles of tallow and beeswax sit stacked beside a wall of clay molds and thread spools. Candle making in a convent is a serious business. No electricity after all. Light was a precious resource reserved for prayer scribing or emergencies, like someone tripping over a cat in the dark. You're handed a strip of linen to twist into wicks. It's greasy from the fat, and your hands quickly smell like burnt stew. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat are cheap but smoky. Beeswax, on the other hand, burns cleaner and smells faintly of honey, but it's expensive and hard to come by. You guess which kind you're making today based on the scent, definitely not honey. As you help dip the wicks into hot wax over and over again, you notice something almost meditative in the rhythm. Dip, cool dip again. The candle thickens, layer by layer, like time itself, pressed into shape. Never rush a candle, Sister Beatrix says. They'll just crack and then you'll be left in the dark. A helpful metaphor, probably also a gentle warning not to mess this up. You learn that candles were often used in strange ways too, like for measuring time. Some convents even carved hour marks into them, so the sisters could time prayers. The candle never lies, one nun says, cryptically. You're not entirely sure what she means, but it sounds profound enough to nod at. After candle making comes something you'd never expect in a convent, a wrestling match. Okay, not literally, but it might as well be because your next task is helping to fit a new mattress into one of the novice beds. And by mattress, we mean a lumpy sack filled with straw feathers and probably some unidentified scratchy things. Two sisters hold one end while you and another try to wrestle the squashed contents into a linen cover without losing half the filling. It takes longer than you'd like to admit. At one point, a chicken feather ends up in your mouth. At another, the mattress flops over like a stunned walrus and knocks a candle stand sideways. It doesn't fall, but you do. Right onto the sack, which honestly feels more comfortable than your current bed. Keep that up and we'll assign you to mattress duty permanently. Someone snickers. You stand dignity mostly intact and help hoist the now evenly packed bedding into place. The nun it's meant for gives you a soft thank you and pats the straw like it's a beloved pet. You understand. Night comes quickly after the candles are lit in the chapel. Their glow flickers off stone walls, and golden crosses cast in long shadows that sway gently with each draft. The sisters gather for Compline, the final prayer of the day. You kneel among them, voice low, breath visible in the air. And though you barely know the words, you hum along to the cadence. The sound vibrates in your chest, slow and steady, like a lullaby meant to stitch the day shut. You walk back to the dormitory, candles flickering behind you. Your robe is soot-dusted and smells faintly of wax and old tallow. Your fingers are stained with ink. Your back aches from mattress wrangling. But your heart, your tired, soothed, half-frozen heart, is just a little bit warmer. Tonight, as you lie in your cot, the straw mattress under you still rustles with the faintest crunch, like a sack of tired autumn leaves. You exhale into the chill and feel your breath rise up and disappear, just like it did last night, and probably like it will again tomorrow. A rhythm settles in your bones, now a kind of monastic muscle memory. Wake, work, pray, sleep, repeat. And somehow, this quiet, icy cycle doesn't seem quite so unbearable anymore. Not that it's comfortable. Let's not get carried away. The next morning, you're up before sunrise, summoned by the gentle but no-nonsense bell. You join the sisters in the chapel, and your voice merges into the low hum of psalms echoing off stone walls. You can feel the faint warmth of the sisters around you, the subtle heat of breath and bodies huddled beneath wool layers, and something else, something like devotion radiating outward like sunbeams trying to reach through thick cloud. After breakfast, which today is a thin barley broth, that if we're being honest, tastes like someone stirred it with a mitten, you're assigned to laundry duty. That's right. Welcome to medieval nun laundry boot camp. And yes, it's as cold as it sounds. You haul linens out behind the cloister to a communal washing trough, where a bucket of near-frozen water waits beside a pile of tunics, veils, and towels that somehow all smell faintly like damp goat. Your fingers plunge into the water and you gasp. It's like someone replaced your hands with icicles. But the nuns next to you scrub calmly, methodically, like frostbite is a state of mind. You try to imitate their tempo hands stinging red as you attack a particularly stubborn ink blotch on a linen sleeve, probably yours. Washing clothes in the Middle Ages involved more than just cold water and hope. Soap wasn't always available, so ashes or fermented urine were used instead. Yes, that's right, P. It had ammonia which helped lift stains, though the smell unforgettable. Thankfully, today's batch seems to rely on ash soap, judging by the earthy scent and lack of retching. Historians still argue whether convents prioritized cleanliness as a spiritual practice or just a necessity to avoid illness. One nun mutters beside you, her sleeves soaked and her hands raw. Either way, it's penance one stain at a time. After laundry, there's time for mending, which, given the state of some of these garments, may as well be classified as textile resurrection. You sit near the hearth with a circle of sisters, patching holes with coarse thread, your needle catching on frayed edges and rough hems. One of the veils has a suspicious tear across it, as if someone caught it on a nail, or maybe wrestled a particularly aggressive goose. You don't ask. Needlework offers a different kind of warmth, not from fire, but from proximity. You're surrounded by gentle murmurs, soft jokes about crooked stitches, shared glances when someone pokes themselves yet again. The camaraderie is subtle, but undeniable. There's a sister named Agnes who sews with military precision. Her fingers fly like tiny soldiers marching across fabric, and she hums a haunting tune under her breath that you can't place. Maybe a lullaby, maybe a warning. She's quiet otherwise, except when she offers you her thimble without looking, just when you need it. You sew the hem of a tunic with a kind of reverence, the fabric warming slightly under your hands. It's a reminder someone wore this while kneeling in prayer, while tending the garden, while sitting awake at 3 a.m., trying to remember the Latin for have mercy. It's not just a tunic, it's the daily uniform of devotion. Later in the kitchen, you help peel turnips, again. But this time, it feels almost meditative. The nuns have turned it into a sort of challenge, who can peel without snapping the root. You lose quickly, your turnip shattering like hopes of a warm bath. Still, the kitchen is one of the warmer places in the convent, especially near the hearth. Steam from boiling cauldrons fogs the air and clings to your cheeks, and you realize, miracle of miracles, you can feel your fingers again. Someone hands you a slice of bread with a smear of honey, and it tastes like dessert from the heavens. You close your eyes, chew slowly, and think about never moving again. But you do move eventually, out into the herb garden this time. Most convents had their own medicinal gardens filled with plants grown not for beauty, but for healing. Sage for sore throats, lavender for sleep, fennel for digestion, and something that smells suspiciously like feet, but is apparently excellent for fevers. You trim back some winter mint, your breath puffing in front of you with every exhale, your fingertips brushing brittle leaves that still cling to life despite the cold. You learn that some nuns doubled as healers, women who knew how to wrap a wound, ease a cough, and mix a salve with little more than beeswax and bark. They weren't always respected outside the cloister, but within these walls, they were trusted with bodies and spirits alike. Historians still debate how much medical knowledge nuns actually possessed versus how much was passed down by trial and error, one sister tells you as she gently lifts a root from the frozen ground. But either way, it worked often enough to matter. You spend the afternoon sorting dried herbs, labeling jars with inked symbols, and trying not to sneeze into the pepper dust. There's something oddly comforting about being surrounded by jars of powder and root and leaf. Like even when it's freezing, the earth still offers little gifts if you know how to look. By dusk, the convent glows golden again. The The sisters walk slowly down the hall, candles in hand, robes, brushing stone floors, prayers on their lips. You follow steps, soft, a little wiser than yesterday. In your cot, you finally slip under the covers, wool layers hugging you close. Your hands are dry from washing, your shoulders ache from sewing. Your back is stiff from leaning into garden beds, but you feel somehow whole. There's a simplicity in this life, even with all its chill and ritual and turnips. You know what comes next, and next, and after that. It doesn't thrill you, but it doesn't frighten you either. You're surviving, and more than that, you're learning how to stay warm in ways no fire can quite match. The next morning begins with the soft echo of the bell again. It tolls slowly in the still dark like a heartbeat you can't quite locate. You rise without thinking now. Your legs swing over the side of the cot, and your toes hit the floor like little stones skipping across an icy pond. You wince, but not as much as the first time. You're becoming something different here, maybe not hardened, but certainly used to the rhythm of discomfort. Today you're given an unusual assignment. The cellaress, one of the most powerful figures in the convent after the abbess, has asked you to help her inventory the warming items distributed among the sisters. In other words, you're going to learn exactly how nuns kept warm officially and creatively. The first stop is the storage room. It's small, drafty, and smells like dried mushrooms and wool. You help the cellaress count out cloaks, heavy brown ones lined with rabbit fur if the convent was lucky. Most are just tightly woven wool, thick with age, stiff at the shoulders where dozens of winters have tried to bite through. You stack them neatly, noticing that some bear embroidered initials. A few are even patched with pieces of older habits, nothing wasted here. The convent's rule strictly limits extravagance. Warmth is not to be sought through vanity. Fur is technically discouraged unless absolutely necessary. But that hasn't stopped the clever hands of nuns from finding ways to push boundaries. Next comes the inspection of foot coverings. A drawer reveals an array of woolen socks, many lovingly darned, some hilariously mismatched. One pair has clearly been repurposed from what was once a sleeve. You try one on. It's itchy, yes, but the warmth it offers is immediate, if a bit lumpy. One nun had the genius idea to stuff her clogs with hay, creating an insulating layer that squeaks faintly when she walks. You give it a try, and surprisingly it works. The squeak is a small price to pay for toasty toes. You pause by a window. Frost has drawn delicate filigree patterns on the panes, as if winter itself tried its hand at manuscript illumination. You rub a circle clear with your sleeve and glance out into the silent courtyard. There's a nun tending to a covered brazier, a rare concession to warmth on especially cruel mornings. Some convents permitted small foot warmers filled with embers, but these were used sparingly and under supervision. Historians still argue whether such heat sources were seen as weakness or compassion, the cellaress says, as she lifts the lid of one iron warmer. But toes don't debate theology, they just ache. You chuckle, then stifle it. Laughter echoes here, and someone's always praying. After inventory, you accompany her to the scriptorium. A few sisters are already hunched over their desks, breath fogging faintly as they etch lines of Latin onto stiff parchment. The cold in this room is particularly cruel: stone walls, high ceilings, and barely any fire. Yet they work without complaint, fingers blue at the tips, their quills scratching like tiny claws across the surface. One sister, elbow deep in gold leaf, wears mittens with the fingertips cut off. Clever. Another has fashioned a sort of shawl that wraps around her neck twice and tucks under her wimple like a woolly boa constrictor. The scriptorium is also where heated stones sometimes make an appearance, carried in from the kitchen, wrapped in cloth, and placed under desks like sleepy dragons. You nudge one with your toe. Still warm. Then there's the cloister walk. You step outside into the covered passage that circles the inner courtyard, and here the cold slinks in sideways. Even with walls and a roof, the wind weaves through the arches, brushing past your veil like a whispered dare. This was where nuns walked for reflection or silent prayer, even in the bleakest seasons. You join a few who are pacing slowly, hands tucked into sleeves, heads bowed not just in piety, but in sheer resistance to the breeze. One sister shares an odd strategy, wearing two habits at once. Forbidden, technically, but if you put one on before matins and then remove it before terce, is it really indulgence? She says with a sly grin. You find yourself smiling more these days, even as your nose runs and your fingers never quite thaw. There's something oddly uplifting about shared suffering, about creative rule-bending that doesn't hurt anyone. And honestly, at this point, wearing two tunics seems more practical than sinful. Another nun tells you about the brick trick, a warm stone or brick placed at the foot of the bed before sleep. It cools quickly, but for that first magical 10 minutes, bliss. One time, she says, a sister accidentally used a rock still dusted in ash from the fire and woke up looking like she'd wrestled a chimney sweep. Still worth it. You notice more of these little innovations everywhere now. Gloves lined with extra cloth from worn-out scapulars. Extra hair tucked under veils to act as insulation. Even prayers said in clusters, shoulders touching for just a bit of stolen heat. You begin to understand the deeper warmth here. It's not just wool and fire and fur. It's the warmth of community of humor shared in whispers of rules, nudged gently aside in the name of mercy. One nun you've barely spoken to slips you a small pouch as you pass in the hallway. Inside are dried rose petals and crushed mint-scented warmth. She doesn't explain. She doesn't have to. That night, you place the pouch inside your sleeve and pull the covers up to your chin. The cold still bites. The walls still breathe frost. But your heart is warm, and your hands, wrapped in borrowed mittens, finally stop trembling. Outside, the wind howls like an impatient ghost. Inside, you drift. The convent's rituals continue. Bells, psalms, turnips, silence, laughter, wool, and maybe, just maybe, you'd survive here after all. So now as you curl deeper into your blanket or nestle your head against a pillow, let the sounds and chill of that ancient stone convent fade into a gentle hush. The dim flicker of candlelight melts away, and the slow, steady breath of sleeping sisters becomes a rhythm in your own chest. Picture that cold corridor empty now, peaceful, and the quiet crunch of hay beneath blankets, long worn, smooth by time. Feel the wool scratchy but comforting, drawn tight against the night. Out in the courtyard, snow begins to fall in slow motion, each flake twirling like a quiet prayer whispered to no one in particular. Inside, the last ember dies down in the hearth, warm enough for one last sigh. The wind outside softens as if it too has fallen asleep. You don't have to pray or chant or even move, just rest. You're safe now. Still, quiet, warm in all the ways that matter. Sleep soft and silent folds itself around you like a well-worn habit.